So in this video, we're going to review the elements of a function. We talked about this a little bit in the first module, but as we're coming back to it now in module 3, I want to go over this again and in a little bit more detail now that you have some experience actually writing JavaScript code. So first of all, there are the identification elements. Functions have a specific structure that allows the compiler to recognize them. You have the command word function, and then you have the user-defined name. You also have the parameters, which are surrounded by parentheses. And here I have an example with a couple of parameters. You can have 0 to infinity, but you want to keep it manageable. You only want to pass in variables that you need to get from another place, right? So think about that as information that is coming from somewhere else into the function. That's the sort of information that you should pass in as parameters. Other things, you can just create local variables within your function and use them just within that space. So you want to pass in the minimum amount of parameters that you can in order for the function to work. There's also the start and end notation indicated by those squiggly brackets. And then, of course, the result or the return. So your function may actually use a return statement. That would be an explicit return, or it could simply do something, and that's the result of the function. Here's an example of syntax. We looked at this one before. You can see the name there, 2 Celsius. It has one parameter, which is called Fahrenheit. And again, you can call that parameter anything you want. You just want to make sure that you're using that same name, because that's basically declaring a variable. So you want to make sure you're using that same variable name within the function itself. If you're passing a variable into a function, it doesn't have to be called Fahrenheit, right? So you could be passing the variable x into this function, and at the time that you make the call, at the time it hits this function, it's going to convert whatever the value of x is into the new variable Fahrenheit that will be initialized when you run the function. It'll be initialized as as that value, whatever value it is that you're sending. You can also send either literal values or variable values in as parameters, and same thing will happen. It'll just put that into the bucket called Fahrenheit that is then used throughout that function. So the other thing that I should note, obviously you can see all of those identity elements that we talked about. There's also the bit in the middle, and that's the algorithm. That's the part that actually does the steps, that actually defines the steps that the function is going to take in order to do its job. So that, of course, is very important, and we're gonna talk about that and work on that in the rest of this module. In order to use those functions that we write, we actually have to invoke or call them. There are 2 main ways to call a function. First, we can call it from elsewhere in the program. So here are a couple of examples. We could set a function equal to a variable and put the return. Basically, what that's going to do is put whatever the return value is into that variable. So functions that have an explicit return are ones that you can use in this way. Functions that simply do a thing, right, that just have a result, that just do something, can also be called in this way by other pieces of code. Just the straight up name of that function can be used to call it if it's a function that just does something and doesn't have an explicit but has an implicit result rather than an explicit return. You can also call a function using an event property in an HTML tag. Here's a couple that are really useful: on load, on click. So for example, on load could function in, say, a body tag. So once the body's loaded, it would call a function. On click, we saw that being used in a button tag. That's a very common way to do that. So it would be any clickable element once it's clicked. There are other event calling properties. These are just a couple of the most common. That gives you a sense of some of the elements of a function. There are some other really important things to think about designing and coding functions, and we will cover those in the other videos for this module.